The rain had become as familiar to her as breathing, its cold fingers tracing paths down her neck, soaking through velvet and silk until the weight of sodden fabric pulled at her shoulders like the very burden of shame itself. London, in the autumn of 1817, seemed perpetually grey, the sky a vault of pewter that opened its stores upon the city with relentless generosity, and Lady Eliza Hartwell had long since stopped seeking shelter from it. She stood now, as she had stood countless times before, in the shadowed corner of the Ashford Terrace, just beyond the reach of the ballroom's golden light, watching the dancers spin and glitter through rain-streaked windows like figures in a music box she was forbidden to touch. 8 years. 8 years of this peculiar ritual, this ghost's attendance at festivities meant for the living, and still she came, her presence a silent penance for sins that were not her own yet clung to her nonetheless. The music drifted out to her in muffled waves, a waltz she recognized from happier times, and she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of memory herself at 17, before the scandal, before her father's disgrace had been splashed across every scandal sheet in London, before embezzlement and ruin had transformed the name Hartwell from respectable to unspeakable. She watched a young woman in rose silk laugh at something her partner said, head thrown back with the careless joy of one who had never known what it meant to be unwelcome, and Eliza felt the familiar ache settle in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Asterisk, I should not be here, asterisk, she thought, yet the same thought had accompanied her to every ball, every musicale, every garden party where she had stationed herself just outside the boundaries of acceptability. Her mother needed this. These tenuous threads of connection to society maintained by Eliza's ritual attendance, even if that attendance consisted of standing in gardens and courtyards rather than dancing in ballrooms. The invitations still came, sent by distant cousins too well-bred to cut them entirely, but too conscious of reputation to truly welcome them, and Eliza transformed those invitations into a kind of truth her mother could live with. Asterisk. Yes. Eliza attended the Ashford ball. Yes, she was there. Asterisk. The lie of omission was a small kindness in a world that had shown them precious little. The rain intensified, drops striking the terrace stones with increased urgency, and Eliza drew her shawl tighter, though it provided no warmth, watching the Duke of Pemberton move through his guests with the fluid grace of a predator among sheep, all cold efficiency and barely concealed disdain. And she wondered, not for the first time, and what it must be like to care so little for the opinions that ruled the rest of them. Julian Ashford, Duke of Pemberton, had perfected the art of appearing engaged while feeling nothing, a skill that served him well during the interminable social obligations his position demanded, and tonight's ball, held in his own ballroom though he would have preferred to be anywhere else, was no exception to the tedium that characterized such gatherings. He moved through the crowd with the efficiency of a man completing a distasteful but necessary task, accepting congratulations on the event's success with minimal acknowledgement, deflecting with practiced ease the increasingly desperate attempts of mothers to thrust their daughters into his path, and maintaining the expression of cold civility that had become as much his armor as the perfectly tailored evening clothes he wore. Marriage held no appeal for him, despite the endless pressure from society and his own solicitors who worried about the succession, because he had observed too clearly what passed for affection among his class, the calculated alliances, the mercenary exchanges of beauty for title or fortune for name, the shallow performances that dissolved into mutual contempt within months of the wedding. He wanted none of it, preferred his solitude to the company of simpering misses who saw only his wealth and position, who performed practiced charm with the authenticity of actors in a particularly tedious play, and he had long since resigned himself to the likelihood that he would die without air, rather than shackle himself to such emptiness. Yet something caught his attention as he stood near the terrace doors, ostensibly listening to Lord Wetherby drone about crop yields, a movement beyond the rain-streaked glass, a figure standing motionless in the downpour, where no sensible person would venture. His first reaction was irritation that someone had wandered into his garden during the storm, creating potential scandal, or at minimum requiring him to send servants to retrieve some fox gentleman or hysterical debutante, but as he watched more carefully, noting the stillness of the figure, the way she for it was clearly a woman from the shape of her gown, simply stood there as though the rain were sunshine, his irritation transmuted into something more complex, something uncomfortably close to curiosity. She did not seek shelter, did not hurry toward the house or away from it, merely existed in that drenched corner of his terrace as though she belonged there, and the oddity of it arrested his attention in a way nothing else had all evening. He watched her for several minutes, forgetting entirely what Weatherby was saying, observing the way she tilted her head slightly, as though listening to the music that filtered faintly through the windows, how her shoulders held a peculiar dignity despite the sodden state of her clothing. And then recognition struck him with unexpected force. He had seen her before, not just tonight but many times, always positioned just beyond the threshold of proper attendance, always alone, always watching from gardens and terraces, as though she were a spirit unable to cross into the world of the living. The realization unsettled him because it meant he had noticed her repeatedly without consciously acknowledging it, that some part of his mind had catalogued her presence at various events over what must have been years, filing away the image of this solitary woman who attended balls without entering them, and the fact that he had paid such attention without meaning to suggested something he preferred not to examine too closely. Still, the puzzle of her presence demanded solution, and Julian Ashford had built his fortune on solving puzzles, on understanding the mechanisms that drove human behavior, so he might exploit or protect against them as circumstances required. And this particular mystery, standing in his garden in a storm, required investigation. He moved through the ballroom with purpose that cut through the festivities like a blade through silk, ignoring Lady Pemberton's attempt to introduce him to her niece, stepping around Lord Hertford without acknowledging his greeting. His focus narrowed to the terrace doors and the mystery that awaited beyond them, and within moments he had crossed the threshold into the rain-soaked night, where the temperature dropped precipitously, and water immediately began darkening the shoulders of his evening coat. She heard his approach. He could tell from the way her spine stiffened, the subtle shift in her posture from contemplative to defensive. But she did not turn to face him, continuing instead to gaze through the windows at the dancers as though his presence were of no consequence, and the deliberate slight of it sparked his irritation anew. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience, "you are standing in my garden during a storm." She turned then, slowly, and he found himself looking into a face that was neither beautiful nor plain, but rather possessed of a quality he could not immediately name, something in the directness of her gaze that suggested she had long since abandoned caring what anyone thought of her appearance, and when she spoke, her voice held the same careful dignity he had observed in her posture. "I am aware of both the garden's ownership and the weather, Your Grace." The formality of her address told him she knew precisely who he was, yet she offered no apology, no explanation, merely met his gaze with a steadiness that most men of his acquaintance could not manage, and he felt his curiosity sharpen into something more focused. "Then perhaps you might explain why you choose to stand in said garden rather than avail yourself of the perfectly adequate ballroom just beyond those windows." She glanced away, back toward the golden light and swirling figures, and something in her expression suggested pain so carefully controlled it had become invisible to those not looking for it. "I prefer the fresh air, Your Grace. Ballrooms can be rather stifling." He knew evasion when he heard it, had employed it himself countless times, and the transparent nature of her deflection told him she was not practiced at deception, which was oddly refreshing in a world built on lies prettily told. "That is the poorest excuse I have heard this evening, and I have endured several hours of tedious conversation that consisted almost entirely of excuses. Try again." Her eyes snapped back to his face, and he saw anger flicker there before she suppressed it, replacing it with that same careful neutrality, but the glimpse of genuine emotion pleased him in a way he did not examine too closely. "Very well. I am not truly welcome inside your ballroom, Your Grace, but I attend nonetheless because my mother's distant relations still send invitations, and she needs whatever threads of connection to society we can maintain. Standing out here allows her to truthfully say, 'I attended,' while sparing everyone inside the discomfort of my actual presence." The honesty of it struck him silent for a moment, the stark admission delivered without self-pity or dramatic flourish, merely stated as fact, and he found himself revising his initial assessment of her. This was not some silly girl seeking attention through theatrical behavior, but rather someone who had calculated the precise mathematics of social survival and found her solution in this peculiar compromise. His response came before he had fully considered it, driven by an impulse he would later recognize as the first breach in walls he had spent years constructing. "If you insist on standing in the rain at my events, madam, you will catch pneumonia and create precisely the sort of scandal you are attempting to avoid. I cannot have guests dying in my shrubbery." Before she could respond, before he could reconsider the wisdom of his action, he took her arm in a grip that was firm without being rough and began propelling her toward the terrace doors, feeling her stiffen in shock, hearing her sharp intake of breath that might have been protest, but he did not slow, did not release her, merely continued his inexorable progress toward the ballroom that would shortly become aware of their entrance in a manner that would make standing in gardens seem positively discreet by comparison. The ballroom's collective intake of breath created a momentary silence more deafening than the orchestra that had ceased mid-phrase, every eye turning toward the terrace doors where the Duke of Pemberton stood with a rain-drenched woman whose sodden gown left puddles on the polished floor, her hair hanging in wet tendrils that destroyed any pretense of respectability, and the whispers began immediately, a rising tide of speculation and scandal that Eliza felt as physical weight pressing against her chest. Mortification flooded through her with heat that contrasted sharply with the chill of her wet clothes. The exact catastrophe she had spent 8 years carefully avoiding now manifested in its most spectacular form, and she turned to Julian with fury sparking in her eyes, despite her awareness that directing anger at a duke in his own ballroom was perhaps unwise. "Your Grace, you have just destroyed what little reputation I managed to preserve," she said, her voice low and trembling with the effort of maintaining composure when she wanted to flee into the night and never return to London society. He looked at her with an expression that suggested her concerns held roughly the same weight as a gnat's opinion, then shifted his gaze to the assembled crowd with such cold dismissal that several people actually stepped backward. "Mrs. Patterson," he called to a servant who materialized instantly, "bring blankets and tea. Lady Hartwell will be joining us this evening." The use of her name, spoken clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, sent another wave of whispers through the crowd, but Julian simply placed his hand at the small of Eliza's back and guided her toward the massive fireplace that dominated one wall of the ballroom, the crowd parting before them with the automaticity of subjects before their sovereign. She wanted to resist, to maintain her anger as protection against the vulnerability she felt dripping onto his floor, but his hand was firm and somehow steadying, and she found herself moving with him despite her intentions. A footman appeared with a chair positioned near the fire's warmth, and Julian deposited her there with surprising gentleness before the blankets arrived, a thick wool that he draped around her shoulders himself rather than waiting for servants to perform the task. "You had no right," she said quietly, watching the flames rather than his face because she could not bear to see either mockery or pity in his expression. "Standing in gardens like a ghost was hardly protecting your reputation either," he countered, his voice carrying that same matter-of-fact quality that made argument feel futile, and she felt her anger waver because he was not entirely wrong, though admitting it felt like conceding more than she could afford to lose. The tea arrived, and he pressed the cup into her hands with a command to drink that brooked no refusal, then turned to survey his ballroom where the guests still hovered in uncertain clusters, clearly unsure whether they should pretend nothing unusual had occurred or abandon the pretense entirely. His glare swept across them with the efficacy of a scythe through wheat, and conversations resumed with forced normalcy, though Eliza noticed many people stealing glances toward the fireplace where she sat, wrapped in blankets like some shipwrecked survivor rather than a proper guest. "They are all staring," she murmured, humiliation coating each word. "Let them stare," Julian replied with such complete indifference that she looked up at him in surprise, seeing in his face an expression of absolute certainty, as though the opinions of everyone in this room combined could not equal the weight of a single one of his decisions, and she realized with a shock that he genuinely did not care what anyone thought, possessed a freedom from social judgment that she had never imagined possible, and the recognition of it shifted something in her understanding of both him and the world he moved through with such impervious confidence. The warmth of the fire began to penetrate the chill that had settled into Eliza's bones, and as sensation returned to her fingers wrapped around the teacup, She became aware that Julian had positioned himself in a chair opposite hers, his posture suggesting he had no intention of moving until his curiosity was satisfied, and when he spoke his voice carried the same commanding tone he might use in a business negotiation. "Now then, Lady Hartwell, I believe I am owed the complete explanation rather than the abbreviated version you provided in the garden." She looked into his face, seeing in the set of his jaw and the directness of his gaze that evasion would be pointless, and found herself oddly relieved to tell the truth to someone who seemed unlikely to offer either false sympathy or moral judgment. "My father, Lord Hartwell, was discovered 8 years ago to have embezzled substantial sums from several noble families with whom he held financial trusts. The scandal was enormous, as you might imagine. He died shortly after the revelation, whether from shame or illness I cannot say with certainty, though I suspect the former hastened the latter." She paused, watching Julian's expression for signs of the disgust or pity she had seen so often, but his face remained neutral, merely attentive, and she continued. "He left my mother and me with nothing but debts and disgrace. We lost our home, most of our possessions, everything that might have provided income. My mother's distant cousins, the Weatherbys, took pity on us to the extent of providing a small house and a minimal allowance, but they made clear we were a shameful burden. They bore out of family obligation rather than affection. They still send invitations to major social events because excluding us entirely would acknowledge the connection they prefer to minimize, but everyone understands I am not truly welcome." She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away despite the vulnerability of the admission. "My mother clings to these invitations as proof that we have not been completely cast out of society, that perhaps someday the scandal will fade enough for us to regain some measure of respectability. I attend because she needs to believe I am making efforts to rehabilitate our standing, even though we both know it is futile. Standing outside allows me to truthfully say I was present without forcing anyone to endure my company, a compromise that has worked adequately until you decided to intervene this evening." Julian absorbed this information in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of contemplation, and Eliza watched something shift behind his eyes, some calculation being made that she could not decipher. What she could not know was that he was experiencing an entirely unexpected emotion, something uncomfortably close to admiration for a woman who would endure 8 years of humiliation out of loyalty to her mother, who would stand in countless rainstorms rather than abandon the fragile hope that sustained someone she loved, and the recognition of such character in a world he had long since dismissed as uniformly shallow disturbed him profoundly. He made a decision in that moment, impulsive and uncharacteristic, driven by an impulse he would spend considerable time attempting to rationalize in the days that followed. "You will attend the remainder of this ball properly, Lady Hartwell, as my guest. Anyone who objects to your presence may leave my house." She stared at him in disbelief, certain she had misheard, but his expression held absolute certainty, the look of a man who had issued an edict he expected to be obeyed without question, and she realized with dawning astonishment that he meant every word. Julian rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man entirely comfortable with command, and extended his hand toward Eliza with an expectation of acceptance that made refusal seem impossible, though she stared at his outstretched palm for a long moment, while her mind grappled with the implications of what he was offering, because accepting his hand meant accepting his protection publicly, meant stepping into the ballroom not as the disgraced daughter skulking at the edges, but as the Duke of Pemberton's chosen partner, and the weight of that transformation felt too enormous to be contained in a single gesture. Yet she found her hand rising to meet his almost without conscious volition, her fingers settling into his palm with a rightness that startled her, and he drew her to her feet with gentle firmness before placing his other hand at the small of her back and guiding her toward the center of the ballroom, where couples moved through the patterns of a waltz, the crowd parting before them with the same automatic deference they had shown earlier, but now tinged with something approaching awe rather than mere shock. She was acutely aware of every eye upon them, of the whispers that followed in their wake like the train of an invisible gown, but Julian seemed utterly oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on positioning them among the dancers as the orchestra began a new measure, and then his arm encircled her waist with a confidence that suggested he had held her thus 1,000 times before rather than never, and they were moving, her body remembering steps she had not danced in 8 years, muscle memory awakening from its long dormancy. Her initial stiffness made her movements wooden and uncertain, the fear of misstep warring with the forgotten pleasure of movement to music. But Julian's hand at her waist provided an anchor of stability, and his lead was so clear, so assured, that her body began to trust his guidance, even as her mind remained caught in confusion about why he was doing this. What possible motivation could drive a man of his position to champion someone so thoroughly ruined? She had expected him to dance adequately, the way most gentlemen danced, with competent boredom, but she discovered instead that he moved with surprising grace, his control of the dance absolute yet gentle, and she found herself relaxing incrementally into the rhythm, her feet finding their old fluidity as forgotten grace returned like water to a dry riverbed. The strange intimacy of being held by someone so powerful and dangerous while the entire ballroom watched created a peculiar sensation in her chest, something between exhilaration and terror, and she dared to glance up at his face to find his expression as stern and unreadable as ever, though something in his eyes suggested a focus that went beyond mere social obligation, and she wondered with dizzy confusion what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized the woman trembling beneath his hands or saw only the scandalous project he had undertaken. His own thoughts ran in equally bewildered channels, a part of him observing his actions from a cool distance and questioning what madness had possessed him to make such a public declaration on behalf of a woman he barely knew, while another part registered the warmth of her waist beneath his palm, the graceful line of her neck as she turned with the music, the way her guard was slowly lowering to reveal the dancer she must have been, before shame drove her into gardens and rain. The waltz ended too quickly and too slowly, time moving with the strange elasticity of moments weighted with significance, and when the final notes faded, he released her with a formal bow that restored the distance between them, the public courtesy of a duke acknowledging a dance partner, and she curtsied in return with automatic grace, while her heart continued its irregular rhythm. He escorted her back to the fireside chair without a word, his expression settling back into its customary coldness, as though the dance had been merely another duty discharged, and then he turned and disappeared into the crowd of guests who immediately surrounded him with attempts at conversation, leaving her alone by the fire with the blanket still draped around her shoulders, and the profound confusion of a woman who could not begin to understand what had just occurred, or what it might mean for the precarious balance of her existence. Weeks passed with the peculiar slowness of time, measured by anticipation rather than clocks, and Eliza discovered that her world had transformed in ways she could scarcely comprehend, because invitations began arriving at the modest house she shared with her mother, thick cream envelopes sealed with wax, bearing the crests of families who had not acknowledged her existence in 8 years, and her mother wept with joy over each one, while Eliza held them with trembling fingers and wondered what sorcery Julian had worked to accomplish such a reversal. She learned later, through whispered conversations overheard at the edges of drawing rooms, that the Duke of Pemberton had sent word to every major hostess in London that Lady Eliza Hartwell was under his protection, and the weight of those words from a man of his power and consequence had been sufficient to override years of scandal and disgrace, forcing society to open doors that had been firmly closed. Her mother's bewilderment matched her joy, asking repeatedly what Eliza had done to earn such favor from the Duke, and Eliza could only shake her head because she herself did not understand his motives, could not fathom why a man who barely knew her would expend his considerable influence on her behalf. She attended events now as a proper guest rather than a ghost haunting gardens, wearing gowns her mother had somehow managed to acquire through careful economy and the charity of distant relations, and she moved through ballrooms with the strange sensation of being visible after years of deliberate invisibility, but she rarely saw Julian, except from across crowded rooms where he stood in clusters of important men discussing business or politics. When their eyes met across these distances, he would nod with curt formality and then turn away, as though she were merely another acquaintance warranting brief acknowledgement, and she began to assume that his interest in her had been temporary, a momentary whim born of that rainy evening and already forgotten in the press of his usual concerns. Then, at the Wetherby Musicale 3 weeks after the ball, she sat listening to a soprano whose technical skill far exceeded her emotional interpretation, and during the intermission when guests rose to take refreshment, Julian appeared at her side with such suddenness that she startled, nearly dropping her glass of lemonade. He asked her opinion of the performance with the same formal courtesy he might extend to any lady of his acquaintance, and she responded with equal formality that the singer possessed admirable range, and they spoke for perhaps 3 minutes about music and weather and other subjects of no consequence whatsoever, before he bowed and withdrew, leaving her confused and oddly disappointed by the brevity and impersonality of their exchange. Yet she noticed that he had sought her out specifically, crossing the room to stand at her side when he might have remained with the gentleman near the windows, and the realization created a small warmth in her chest that she tried very hard to dismiss as meaningless. A pattern began to establish itself over the following weeks, subtle enough that she wondered if she was imagining significance where none existed, but persistent enough that she could not entirely discount it. He would appear at events she attended, materialize at her side during moments when she stood alone, speak with her briefly about nothing important, reveal absolutely nothing of his thoughts or feelings, and then withdraw back into his role as the cold, calculating Duke of Pemberton, whom everyone feared and no one truly knew, and she found herself watching for these moments with an anticipation that troubled her, because it suggested she cared more than was wise about the attentions of a man whose motivations remained utterly opaque to her understanding. Autumn arrived with its characteristic melancholy, painting London in shades of amber and rust that seemed to echo the uncertainty coloring Eliza's days. And with the changing season came an unexpected development that threw both her and her mother into fresh confusion, because Julian began calling at their modest home on Tuesday afternoons with such regularity that the neighbors began to take notice and whisper behind their curtains. His stated purpose for these visits was business related to her late father's estate, some complicated matter involving outstanding debts and property claims that required her mother's signature on various documents, and her mother received him in their small drawing room with such nervous delight that Eliza worried she might actually swoon from the honor of having the Duke of Pemberton take tea in their shabby parlor with its faded wallpaper and wall furniture. The visits themselves were exercises in formality that left Eliza more frustrated with each passing week, because Julian would arrive precisely at 3 o'clock, spend exactly 45 minutes discussing tedious financial matters with her mother while barely glancing in Eliza's direction, accept 1 cup of tea served in their second-best china, and then depart with the same cold courtesy he might show any minor acquaintance. Yet he returned every single Tuesday without fail, as though drawn by some obligation he never explained. She found herself watching him during these visits with growing irritation, studying the stern line of his jaw as he reviewed documents with her mother, the way his long fingers held his teacup with unexpected delicacy, the occasional moments when his eyes would flick toward her and then away as though he had caught himself in some impropriety, and she could not fathom what game he was playing or why he bothered to come at all if he intended to maintain such rigid distance. After 6 weeks of this maddening pattern, she could bear it no longer, and when he rose to take his leave one crisp October afternoon, she followed him out to the small garden behind their house, under the pretense of seeing him to his carriage, though they both knew the garden path led nowhere near the street. He paused among her mother's struggling rose bushes, turning to face her with that infuriatingly neutral expression, and she confronted him directly with a boldness born of accumulated frustration, asking why he was really bothering with them, what possible interest he could have in the minor financial affairs of a disgraced family when he had empires of commerce to manage. He deflected smoothly, speaking of business obligations and proper settlement of accounts, his voice carrying that same cool detachment he used in every conversation, but she had learned to read the subtle signs of his discomfort in the way his shoulders tensed slightly, and she pressed harder, telling him she was not a fool to be placated with convenient lies. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, some internal calculation being made, before he finally spoke with uncharacteristic terseness that he found her company tolerable compared to the usual society vapidity, the words delivered as though dragged from him against his will, and representing perhaps the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given anyone. The admission hung in the cool autumn air between them, and Eliza felt her irritation transform into something warmer and more dangerous, a small smile threatening the corners of her mouth, despite her best efforts at maintaining dignity, and for just a moment His expression softened almost imperceptibly before he caught himself and restored his customary coldness, bowing formally and retreating to his waiting carriage, while she stood among the dying roses, and wondered what it meant that the formidable Duke of Pemberton found her tolerable, and whether tolerable might be his word for something he could not yet name. Julian sat in his study long after midnight, staring at the ledgers before him without seeing the numbers, because his mind had become an unreliable instrument that insisted on conjuring images of Eliza Hartwell at the most inconvenient moments. The way she had almost smiled in the garden when he called her company tolerable, the particular grace of her hands as she poured tea, the intelligence in her eyes when she caught him in evasions, and he recognized these intrusions for what they were, with the same cold clarity he applied to business analysis, understanding that he was developing feelings for her, and that such feelings represented a dangerous vulnerability he had sworn never to permit himself. His past rose around him in the quiet darkness like accusatory ghosts, memories of his father stumbling home drunk from gaming hells, of creditors pounding on doors while his mother wept in her chambers, of the slow dismemberment of the family estate piece by piece until nothing remained but debts and shame and a dukedom that existed in title only, stripped of all material substance that should have accompanied such rank. He had been 16 when his father finally drank himself to death, 16 when he inherited a legacy of ruin and disgrace, and he had rebuilt everything through sheer ruthless determination and calculation that left no room for sentiment or weakness, treating every business dealing as warfare and every social interaction as strategy, constructing walls around himself so high and thick that nothing could penetrate to the vulnerable core where the frightened boy still lived. He had promised himself then that he would never be weak the way his father had been weak, never allow emotion to override judgment, never permit himself to care for anything so much that its loss could destroy him, and he had kept that promise for 15 years with perfect discipline until Eliza appeared in his life like rain seeping through stone, persistent and patient and utterly unconcerned with his defenses. What unsettled him most profoundly was not the fact of his attraction to her but the nature of it, because he found himself drawn not to conventional beauty or social grace, but to qualities he had convinced himself did not exist: her quiet dignity in the face of years of humiliation, her loyalty to a mother who could offer her nothing in return, her complete lack of pretense or manipulation, the way she endured rather than complained, stood in rain rather than abandoned principle. He caught himself thinking of her at odd moments during business meetings, wondering what she might say about some proposed venture, imagining her response to various situations, and these mental invasions troubled him because they suggested she had already breached his carefully maintained isolation without his conscious permission. The realization that he was vulnerable to her, that she possessed the power to hurt him simply by existing and then potentially leaving, created a panic in his chest that he recognized from childhood, that familiar terror of helplessness and loss, and he made the decision with characteristic swift brutality that he must distance himself immediately before this weakness progressed beyond his ability to contain it. He stopped calling on Tuesday afternoons, stopped seeking her out at social events, avoided any gathering where he knew she might appear, and told himself he was being practical and self-protective while ignoring the hollow ache that opened in his chest whenever he thought of her standing in some garden, wondering why he had abandoned her without explanation, though he assured himself she would be relieved rather than hurt, because what woman of sense would want the attentions of a man as cold and damaged as he had become? The scandal erupted 3 weeks into Julian's self-imposed absence, with the sudden violence of a summer storm, though November's chill had settled over London, and there was nothing summery about the vicious gossip that spread through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs like contagion, because Eliza's father's former business partner, a man named Thomas Wickham who had fled to the continent years earlier to escape his own creditors, returned to London with renewed malice and began spreading rumors that Eliza's mother had been complicit in the embezzlement scheme, that she had known of her husband's crimes and helped conceal them, that the modest widow living on charity was, in fact, sitting on hidden wealth stolen from noble families. The accusations were absurd to anyone who knew the true destitution in which Eliza and her mother lived, but society had never required truth when scandal proved more entertaining, and the whispers multiplied with each retelling until they became accepted fact in certain circles, transforming sympathy for a disgraced widow into contempt for an alleged criminal. The invitations that had begun arriving after Julian's protection ceased as abruptly as they had started, and Eliza found herself once again unwelcome in the world she had briefly been permitted to enter, though this time the exile carried a sharper edge of cruelty, because she had tasted acceptance before having it snatched away, and her mother wept quietly in their parlor, while Eliza stood rigid with a fury she could not safely express. She returned to her old practice of standing outside balls in the rain, partly from that same stubborn loyalty to her mother, who insisted they maintain appearances, but partly from a darker impulse she barely acknowledged even to herself, a desire to witness her own degradation, to stand in the cold and watch the warm lights, and know she would never again be permitted inside, a form of self-punishment for the foolish hope she had allowed to take root during those weeks when Julian had called every Tuesday and made her believe she might deserve something better than endless rain. The evening of the Thornbury ball arrived with characteristic November bleakness, rain falling in cold sheets that soaked through her cloak within minutes, and she took her familiar position in the garden where she could see the ballroom windows blazing with light and movement. But this time she was not alone in her vigil, because young men had begun coming outside, specifically to mock her, to point and laugh at the embezzler's daughter, standing in the rain like some Gothic spectre, and on this particular evening, 3 of them approached her with the casual cruelty of those who had never known real consequence. She endured their mockery with the rigid dignity that had become her armor over 8 years of humiliation, refusing to retreat or respond, standing utterly still, while they circled and made observations about her sodden appearance, and questioned whether she was waiting for another duke to rescue her, or had she finally accepted her proper place among the garden statuary, and she felt something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest that was not quite despair because she had lived with despair too long to mistake it, but rather a kind of resignation that this was simply what her life would be until age or illness finally released her from the obligation of endurance. Then she heard the sound of a carriage arriving late, its wheels splashing through puddles, and she felt rather than saw the attention of her tormentors shift toward the new arrival, their mockery trailing off into uncertain silence, and when she finally raised her eyes from the ground where she had fixed them, she saw Julian Ashford emerging from his carriage with an expression of such cold fury that even through the rain and darkness she could feel the lethal calm radiating from him as he approached with the measured steps of a predator who had sighted prey and was in absolutely no hurry because escape was impossible. Julian's intervention was swift and devastating in its precision, because he had spent 15 years learning exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, and he applied that knowledge now with surgical coldness as he stepped between Eliza and her tormentors, his voice cutting through the rain with quiet menace as he addressed the 3 young men by name and title, which already unsettled them because they had not expected to be recognized or remembered by a duke. He began with Lord Ashworth's son, mentioning in conversational tones how unfortunate it would be if certain gambling debts came to light, debts the young man's father believed had been settled, but which Julian happened to know were still outstanding to a moneylender of questionable reputation, and how such information might affect the family's standing if it reached the wrong ears, which of course it wouldn't unless Julian felt compelled to share it. He turned next to the Honourable Mr. Fitzwilliam, observing almost pleasantly that his sister's upcoming engagement to the Marquis of Rothbury might encounter difficulties if the Marquis learned about the family's actual financial situation, which was considerably more precarious than they had represented, information that Julian possessed through his various business interests, but had seen no reason to disclose until now. The 3rd young man, a baronet's heir whose smugness had already crumbled into terror, received only a single sentence about his mother's correspondence with a certain Italian count, delivered with such cold implication that the young man turned white and stumbled backward. They fled with remarkable speed, nearly tripping over themselves in their haste to return to the ballroom's safety, and Julian watched them go with the detached satisfaction of someone who had just completed a necessary but distasteful task, before turning to Eliza, who stood exactly where she had been standing throughout the entire confrontation, rigid and soaked and shaking with something that was not cold. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had endured years of humiliation with dignity he could barely comprehend, and something fundamental shifted in his chest, and some wall he had maintained through pure will, finally cracking under the weight of her quiet suffering, and without saying a word, he removed his coat and stepped forward to drape it around her shoulders, the gesture simple and utterly inadequate, but the only comfort he knew how to offer. He took her arm gently, so different from that first night when he had pulled her inside with brusque command, and led her toward his waiting carriage while she moved beside him like someone in a dream, her composure finally fracturing after years of holding herself together through sheer force of will. In the carriage's privacy, with rain drumming on the roof and darkness concealing them from the world's judgment, she began to cry with quiet desperation, tears sliding down her face while she tried uselessly to stop them, apologizing in a broken whisper for her weakness. Julian sat rigidly beside her, completely unprepared for her tears, because in all his careful planning and strategic thinking, he had never once considered what he would do if she actually broke in front of him, and for several long moments he simply sat frozen while she wept, until some instinct, deeper than thought, made him move closer and put his arm awkwardly around her shoulders. The gesture uncertain but genuine, she leaned into him immediately, too exhausted and broken to maintain the pride that had sustained her through 8 years of standing in rain, and he held her carefully while she cried against his chest, one hand rising hesitantly to rest against her wet hair, and neither of them spoke because there were no words adequate to the moment, only the sound of rain and her quiet weeping, and the startling intimacy of two people who had spent years protecting themselves, finally permitting touch, finally acknowledging need, finally surrendering to the terrifying possibility that perhaps they did not have to endure their respective isolations alone. Julian took Eliza to his townhouse instead of her home, because propriety had ceased to matter the moment he watched her, standing in the rain, being mocked by fools, and she was too distraught to protest the impropriety, and too exhausted, from years of maintaining impossible dignity, to care that arriving at a bachelor's residence unchaperoned would create exactly the kind of scandal she had spent 8 years trying to avoid. His housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, a woman who had served the Ashford family for 3 decades and possessed the rare quality of never being shocked by anything her employer did, took one look at Eliza's tear-stained face and sodden dress and took charge with brisk efficiency, leading her upstairs to a guest room and promising hot water and dry clothes, without asking a single question about why the Duke had brought home a weeping woman in the middle of the night. Julian retreated to his study and paced the length of it repeatedly, disturbed by the intensity of his own fury on Eliza's behalf, because he had built his entire adult life on the principle of emotional detachment, and yet watching those young men mock her had filled him with a rage so complete it had taken every ounce of his considerable self-control not to strike them, and the realization that he cared this much about her suffering terrified him more than any business adversary ever had. When Eliza finally emerged nearly an hour later, wearing one of his sister's old dresses that Mrs. Davies had found in storage, her hair dried and loosely braided, her face composed but exhausted, he led her to his library, where a fire burned against the November chill, and they sat in leather chairs that faced each other across a small table, and for several long moments neither spoke, because the intimacy of this situation, of being alone together in his home late at night, created a kind of silence that felt too significant to break carelessly. She thanked him first, her voice quiet but steady, for his intervention with those young men, for his protection both tonight and in the weeks before, and then she said what he had been dreading she would say, that she could not keep accepting his help because it only made things worse for her in the end. Attached her name to his in ways that would eventually damage her further when he inevitably married someone appropriate to his station and she was left alone again, but now with the additional scandal of having been the Duke of Pemberton's peculiar charity case. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire while he considered how to articulate something he had barely admitted to himself. And then he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual cold command, but instead a careful honesty that cost him considerably to express, that he had no intention of marrying anyone appropriate, and the words hung in the air between them, weighted with implication he made no attempt to disguise. The implication hung between them in the firelit silence, weighted with meaning that neither could pretend to misunderstand, and Eliza stared at him with disbelief, written across her exhausted features, because surely she had misheard. Surely the Duke of Pemberton could not possibly be suggesting what his words seemed to suggest. Julian met her gaze steadily, his expression revealing none of the turmoil churning beneath his carefully maintained composure. and he began to speak with the careful deliberation of someone articulating thoughts he had never intended to voice aloud, telling her that he had watched her for 8 years, though she had never known it, that he had first noticed her standing outside his ball in the rain 5 years ago, during that brutal winter when snow had mixed with freezing rain, and yet she had remained in his garden for nearly 2 hours. He admitted that he had been intrigued even then by someone who would endure such punishment rather than abandon duty to her mother, had found himself looking for her at subsequent events, noticing her presence in courtyards and on terraces, observing her quiet dignity in the face of society's cruelty, and somewhere during those years of watching her stand alone in all weather while maintaining grace that most people could not manage in the warmth of ballrooms, he had realized she possessed exactly the character he had always claimed did not exist in women of their class. She processed this revelation slowly, her mind struggling to reconcile the cold, calculating Duke she thought she knew, with this man who admitted to years of observation and years of noticing her when she had believed herself invisible, and she found her voice finally to ask why he had never approached her before, if he had been watching for so long. His answer was brutally honest in its self-awareness, because he had been afraid of exactly this, of caring about someone enough that her suffering could wound him, of discovering that beneath all his carefully constructed defenses, he was as vulnerable as any other man when faced with a woman who moved him. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, some long-frozen part of herself beginning to thaw under the heat of his confession, and she heard herself admitting quietly that she had noticed him too from outside those ballroom windows, that among all the men who danced and postured and performed for society's approval, he had been the one who never seemed to be performing, who moved through crowds with the same isolation she felt standing in rain, and she had wondered sometimes if perhaps he understood what it meant to be alone in the midst of people. Their eyes met across the small table with recognition that went deeper than attraction, deeper than the practical considerations of marriage and station, recognition of two souls who had survived their respective isolations through endurance rather than hope, and in that moment of mutual understanding, something fundamentally changed between them, some barrier dissolving to reveal the possibility that perhaps neither of them had to stand alone anymore, that perhaps two people who had learned to expect nothing from life might dare to reach for something more. Eliza's barriers finally crumbled under the weight of his confession and years of accumulated loneliness, and she heard herself admitting in a voice that shook despite her efforts to control it how unbearably lonely these years had been, how she had taught herself not to want connection, because wanting only made the isolation more painful, how the burden of her father's shame had become so heavy she sometimes forgot what it felt like to stand upright, without that weight pressing down on her shoulders. The words came haltingly at first, and then in a rush, 8 years of carefully guarded emotion spilling out in the safety of his library while the fire crackled and the rest of London slept, and Julian listened with an attention so complete it felt like being truly seen for the first time in her adult life. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by her own honesty, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking, and his voice, when it came, was gentler than she had ever heard it, and stripped of all its usual cold command, as he admitted that he understood loneliness perhaps better than anyone realized, that his reputation for coldness was not accidental but carefully constructed, a fortress built around himself to ensure he never felt deeply enough to be hurt. He told her about the isolation of watching his father destroy their family through weakness and poor judgment, about rebuilding their fortune alone while society whispered about the Ashford decline, about the deliberate decision to never allow anyone close enough to wound him the way his father's failures had wounded him. His hand found hers across the small table, a gesture so tentative it might have been accidental, except for the way his fingers tightened around hers when she didn't pull away, and they sat like that in the firelight, speaking truths neither had ever voiced before, comparing their respective prisons with the careful precision of cartographers mapping familiar but unshared territory. She spoke of standing in rain watching life happen to other people, and he spoke of standing in ballrooms feeling equally removed from the dancing and laughter around him, and somewhere in the deep hours of the night they both recognized the kinship between two souls who had survived by enduring rather than feeling, by accepting loneliness as the price of safety. The conversation wound through memories and confessions and long silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward, and when he finally asked, his voice carrying an uncertainty she had never heard from the confident Duke of Pemberton, whether she could imagine building a life with someone as difficult and cold as he knew himself to be. She looked at him with eyes that had learned to see through appearances to the truth beneath, and told him that she had spent 8 years, standing in rain and storms, had learned to endure cold and wet, and the cutting wind of society's disapproval, and she was not afraid of difficult things, least of all a man whose coldness was merely armor, protecting the same kind of wounded heart she carried in her own chest. The following morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the library windows, where neither Eliza nor Julian had slept, their conversation having stretched through the entire night until exhaustion and emotion left them dozing in their respective chairs as dawn broke over London. And when Mrs. Davies discovered them, she tactfully withdrew to arrange for a carriage to return, Eliza home before the household fully awakened to find the Duke alone with an unmarried woman. Julian accompanied Eliza to her modest townhouse in respectable silence, but the air between them thrummed with the weight of everything spoken in darkness, and when he handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers, just a moment longer than propriety allowed, a promise of intentions yet to be formally declared. He returned 3 hours later, properly dressed for a formal call, and requested an audience with Eliza's mother, with such grave courtesy that the poor woman nearly fainted from anxiety about what the Duke of Pemberton could possibly want with her disgraced family. Julian wasted no time on pleasantries once they were seated in the shabby drawing-room, stating clearly and without preamble that he wished permission to court Eliza, with the explicit intention of asking for her hand in marriage. And Mrs. Hartwell's shock manifested in stammered disbelief, followed by overwhelming relief that her daughter might finally escape the shadow of her father's sins through such an advantageous match. Eliza, summoned to the drawing-room to hear the Duke's formal request, felt her emotions twist into complicated knots of gratitude and fear, because while her heart had opened to Julian in the vulnerable hours of darkness, daylight brought the cold clarity that perhaps he was acting from pity or obligation, rescuing her the way he might rescue any unfortunate creature found suffering in his garden. She maintained composure through her mother's tearful joy and Julian's formal recitation of his intentions, but when her mother excused herself to compose herself and share the extraordinary news with their housekeeper, Eliza turned to Julian with eyes that demanded truth rather than pretty courtesies. She asked him directly, her voice steady despite the fear making her hands tremble, whether he was doing this because he felt sorry for her or because he believed himself somehow responsible for her well-being after having extended his protection, because she could not bear to enter a marriage built on obligation, no matter how gilded the cage might be. Julian's expression darkened with frustration, the careful control he'd maintained during the formal request cracking to reveal genuine anger beneath, and he stood abruptly to pace the small room like a caged wolf, asking her roughly whether she truly believed him capable of proposing marriage out of pity when he'd spent years avoiding even the suggestion of matrimony, despite tremendous pressure from society and family. Their first real argument erupted in that shabby drawing-room, both of them speaking with more raw honesty than they'd intended, her accusations of noble sacrifice meeting his furious denials, until finally he stopped pacing and turned to face her with something almost desperate in his usually controlled features. He told her, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to disguise, that he had never in his entire life done anything out of obligation that he didn't absolutely have to do, and that every action he took was calculated for his own benefit or protection, and marrying her was decidedly not an obligation, but rather the first purely selfish thing he had wanted in years, the first time he'd reached for something simply because the thought of not having it was unbearable. The raw honesty of his confession, stripped of all courtly language and romantic pretense, convinced her where prettier words would have failed, because she recognized in his frustrated admission the same selfishness she felt when she imagined a future without him, and she found herself stepping closer to him, despite all the rules of propriety that said she should maintain distance until they were formally engaged, her hand reaching for his as she told him quietly that if he was certain this was what he wanted, if he could accept that she came with nothing but scandal and a mother who would require their care and a heart that had learned to protect itself through years of isolation, then yes, she would very much like to be courted by the Duke of Pemberton with the understanding that such courtship would lead to marriage if they both found they could build a life together. The courtship period unfolded under the merciless scrutiny of London society. Every appearance together analysed and dissected in drawing rooms across Mayfair, every glance between them noted and reported, with the breathless excitement of witnesses to an impossible phenomenon, because the Duke of Pemberton was courting the disgraced daughter of an embezzler, and doing so with such obvious determination that even the most vicious gossips found themselves uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Julian moved through the whispers and speculation with his characteristic indifference to public opinion, attending every event where Eliza was present with a consistency that bordered on ritual, his steady and quiet presence at her side, serving as both shield and declaration of intent that grew more powerful with each passing week. Eliza, by contrast, remained painfully aware of every whispered comment, every raised eyebrow, every calculating look from matrons reassessing their opinions based solely on the Duke's favour, and the contrast between his absolute unconcern and her hyper-awareness of being watched created a strange tension between them that somehow deepened their connection rather than weakening it. She noticed the small gestures of protection he offered without seeming to realize he was making them the way he positioned himself, slightly behind her in crowded rooms, so she could feel his presence without having to look for him, how he brought her tea prepared, exactly as she preferred, without ever having asked her preferences, but having observed them carefully enough to know she took it with honey rather than sugar, and preferred it strong enough to be nearly bitter. The afternoon he invited her driving in Hyde Park stretched from the intended hour-long appearance into nearly 3 hours as they circled the paths, talking about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing so naturally that neither noticed the passage of time until the light began to fade, and Julian's groom cleared his throat apologetically to remind them that proper young ladies should be home before dinner. Society's perception shifted gradually under the relentless pressure of Julian's wealth and power, combined with the undeniable evidence of his genuine attachment, and invitations that had been cautiously extended to Eliza began arriving with real welcome rather than nervous obligation. Hostesses realizing that snubbing the future Duchess of Pemberton would be considerably more dangerous than accepting the scandal of her father's crimes. The first time Lady Thornbury approached Eliza at a musicale to offer a stilted apology for past coldness, claiming she had been misinformed about the circumstances of Mr. Hartwell's death, Eliza felt her emotions twist into complicated knots of vindication and resentment, because while she was grateful for the restoration of her social position, she understood with clear-eyed honesty that this acceptance came not from any reassessment of her worth, but purely from her attachment to a man powerful enough to force society's hand, and the knowledge left her feeling simultaneously grateful and diminished, rescued but not redeemed on her own merits. And when she mentioned these conflicted feelings to Julian during their next private conversation, he listened with that complete attention she had come to treasure, and told her quietly that he understood her frustration, but that society had never operated on merit, and never would, and perhaps the best revenge was to use the power his name gave her to extend the same protection to others that she herself had needed for so long. As the weeks of courtship deepened into something richer and more substantial, Eliza discovered layers beneath Julian's cold exterior that society had never bothered to look for, small revelations that arrived like gifts, unwrapped slowly over time. And she learned through careful observation and his housekeeper's discreet comments that the Duke had quietly supported no fewer than 7 families ruined by circumstances beyond their control, providing anonymous funds to cover debts or secure positions for sons who would otherwise have faced debtor's prison. His charity extended without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, because he seemed to believe that wealth carried obligations he fulfilled with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business dealings. She noticed how fiercely he protected those few people he considered his, the way he'd dismissed a steward for speaking dismissively to an elderly tenant, how he'd personally ensured his stable master's daughter received proper medical care when she fell ill, the quiet fury with which he'd addressed a businessman who'd attempted to cheat one of his smaller investors, and she began to understand that his coldness was not his nature, but rather armor, carefully constructed against a world that had taught him early that vulnerability meant destruction, that the boy who'd watched his father gamble away their fortune had built himself into a man who would never again be powerless or exposed to the cruelties of circumstance. Julian, for his part, found himself experiencing emotions he'd long considered beneath him or impossible for someone of his temperament, discovering an unexpected joy in small domestic moments that had nothing to do with power or status or the careful maintenance of his reputation, and he caught himself smiling at odd times when he remembered the way Eliza had laughed at one of his dry observations about Lady Weatherby's impossible feathered turban, a laugh that started as a surprised burst and then softened into something genuine and unguarded that made him want to say amusing things more often, just to hear that sound again. He granted her permission to reorganize his library during one of her visits, expecting to find the changes irritating because he'd maintained that particular system for years. But when he entered the room after she'd finished, he discovered she'd somehow made it better, grouping the volumes in ways that felt more natural and logical, while adding small touches of warmth through the placement of his favorite reading chair nearer the window and fresh flowers on the side table, transformations that made the space feel lived in rather than merely functional. And he realized she had an instinct for creating comfort that he'd never developed because he'd spent so long focused purely on survival and success. The evening she played piano for him marked a turning point, neither of them fully recognized until later, because she'd mentioned in passing that she used to play before her father's death, and Julian had simply opened the door to his music room and waited, offering no pressure but extending clear invitation, and after a long moment of hesitation, she'd seated herself at the instrument, with hands that trembled slightly before finding the keys, and beginning a sonata that started tentatively, but grew in confidence as muscle memory overcame years of disuse. Julian stood absolutely still near the window as she played, watching her profile in the lamplight and listening to music that seemed to pour directly from her heart through her fingers, each note carrying the weight of everything she'd lost and endured and somehow survived. And he felt something shift fundamentally in his chest as he realized he'd never heard anything more beautiful in his entire carefully controlled life, not because of technical perfection, but because of the raw emotion she allowed into each phrase, the vulnerability she was willing to show him through this medium when words still sometimes failed them both, and when the final notes faded into silence, and she sat with her hands resting on the keys, not looking at him. He crossed the room and kissed her for the first time, a gentle press of lips that asked permission even as it offered promise, and she turned into the kiss with a soft sound of surrender that told him everything he needed to know about her feelings, matching the intensity of his own. The wedding preparations unfolded with surprising swiftness once Julian made his intentions clear, because a duke of his standing could arrange matters with an efficiency that would have taken ordinary families months to coordinate, though he consulted Eliza on every detail with a careful attention that revealed how much he wanted this day to reflect her wishes rather than society's expectations, and together they chose a path that honored the intimacy of what they'd built rather than the spectacle that tradition demanded. Eliza's gown arrived from the modist 3 weeks before the ceremony, created from ivory silk that caught the light with subtle elegance rather than ostentatious embellishment, the design reflecting her quiet grace through clean lines and delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline. And when her mother wept at the sight of her daughter in the finished creation, Eliza understood that these were tears not just of joy but of relief, that her daughter would finally know security and position after so many years of enduring shame and isolation. The morning of the wedding found Julian uncharacteristically restless in his chambers, pacing before the window while his valet attempted to help him dress, and the nervousness he felt struck him as absurd, given that he'd negotiated business deals worth fortunes without a tremor and faced down hostile competitors with perfect calm, yet the prospect of standing before Eliza and promising her forever left his hands slightly unsteady as he fastened his cravat for the third time, because the first 2 attempts had seemed insufficiently perfect for this particular occasion. The ceremony took place in his private chapel rather than the grand cathedral where society weddings traditionally occurred. His deliberate choice made out of respect for Eliza's complicated relationship with public attention and his own preference for meaningful intimacy over performative display. And the small gathering of witnesses included only those people who genuinely cared for them, rather than the hundreds of obligatory guests who would have attended a traditional ducal wedding. Eliza walked down the short aisle on her mother's arm, her veil of delicate Brussels lace obscuring her features until she reached Julian's side, and he turned to face her fully for the first time that morning. And when he lifted the veil with hands that trembled slightly despite his attempt at composure, she saw something in his eyes she'd never witnessed before, unguarded hope, mixed with wonder, and a vulnerability so profound it made her breath catch. Because this man who'd armored himself against feeling for so long was looking at her as though she represented every possibility of happiness he'd convinced himself he would never deserve. Their vows followed the traditional Anglican service, words spoken countless times by countless couples, yet each phrase carried weight and meaning specific to their particular journey, from rain-soaked stranger to beloved partner. And when Julian promised to honor and keep her in sickness and health, in prosperity and adversity, his voice dropped slightly on the word adversity, as though acknowledging all the storms they'd already weathered separately and would now face together. The wedding breakfast following the ceremony remained small and intimate, held in Julian's formal dining room with late autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows. And when the moment came for toasts, Julian rose with his champagne glass and spoke with uncharacteristic emotion about finding his Duchess, standing in the rain and realizing that he would gladly weather any storm, endure any hardship, brave any difficulty to keep her safe and warm and loved for the rest of their lives together, words that brought tears to Eliza's eyes and knowing smiles to the faces of their guests, who understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. The transformation of two people who'd survived through endurance learning, finally to thrive through connection. The wedding night arrived with a tenderness neither had anticipated, because two people who'd spent years armoring themselves against vulnerability discovered that removing those defenses required more courage than maintaining them ever had. And when Julian led Eliza through the doorway of his private chambers, their chambers now, he corrected himself silently. He found his hands trembling slightly as he helped her remove the delicate pearl pins from her hair, each small intimacy revealing how little experience either possessed in allowing another person past their carefully constructed walls. She stood before him in the lamplight, wearing only her chemise and dressing gown, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders in a way he'd never seen before, and the vulnerability in her expression mirrored what he felt but had never learned to articulate. This strange mixture of desire and fear and hope that someone who truly knew you might still choose to stay. Their coming together unfolded slowly, tentatively, marked by whispered reassurances and gentle touches that spoke of patience rather than passion's urgency. And when he finally held her afterward, skin against skin in the darkness, he felt something fundamental shift inside him, as though the last frozen corner of his heart had finally begun to thaw beneath the warmth of her presence. The early weeks of marriage brought adjustments neither had fully anticipated, because sharing space and life with another person after years of essential solitude required constant negotiation and compromise, and their first real conflict arose over something as mundane as household management, when Eliza attempted to reorganize the servants' schedules to be more efficient, and Julian's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, complained to him privately that the new Duchess was overstepping. He approached Eliza about it with careful diplomacy that evening in the library, suggesting perhaps she might consult with him before making significant changes, and he watched her face close down in a way that reminded him painfully of those early days when she'd stood outside in the rain, shut out from belonging anywhere. She apologized stiffly, said she'd clearly misunderstood her role, that she should have known better than to presume she could simply step into being a proper duchess when she had no training for such a position, and beneath the formal words he heard the deeper fear that she wasn't enough, would never be enough, that he would eventually recognize his mistake in choosing someone so tainted by scandal and poverty. Julian crossed the room and took her hands in his, waited until she finally met his eyes, then told her with rough honesty that he didn't give a damn about her being a proper duchess according to society's standards, that he'd married her precisely because she wasn't like every other titled woman he'd ever met, and if Mrs. Davies or anyone else in his household had a problem with his wife's management, then they could seek employment elsewhere because Eliza was the Duchess of Pemberton and this was her home to run as she saw fit. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made her eyes fill with tears even as she smiled, and she admitted quietly that she'd been terrified of disappointing him, of proving unequal to the position he'd given her, and he pulled her into his arms and confessed his own fear that she would eventually realize she'd married a cold, difficult man who would never be the romantic husband she deserved, that she'd wake one morning and regret choosing someone so fundamentally damaged by his past. She laughed softly against his chest, a sound both sad and tender, and reminded him that she'd spent 8 years standing in the rain, watching other people dance, that she knew exactly what loneliness felt like and had chosen him anyway, not despite his difficulties but because she understood them, because two people who'd survived through endurance had found in each other the possibility of something more than mere survival. The first morning she woke as Duchess of Pemberton to find Julian already awake beside her, propped on one elbow, watching her with an expression of quiet wonder. She felt self-conscious under his steady gaze and asked what he was thinking, and he said simply that he'd resigned himself to loneliness before her, had built his entire life around the assumption that happiness was something other people experienced, while he focused on duty and power and the careful maintenance of his position, that he'd never imagined actually feeling the kind of contentment that made him want to stay in bed watching his wife sleep, instead of rising early to manage his correspondence and business affairs. Eliza reached up to touch his face, traced the sharp line of his jaw with gentle fingers, and told him that she'd resigned herself to the rain, to standing forever outside looking in at warmth and belonging she would never experience, that she'd never imagined being warm the way she felt now, safe and cherished, and finally home. 3 years had passed since that rain-soaked evening when Julian first pulled Eliza from the terrace into his ballroom, and the annual Ashford ball had become tradition again, though now she stood inside as hostess rather than outside as ghost, moving through the crowded rooms with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd finally learned she belonged somewhere. And as she paused near the tall windows overlooking the garden, adjusting a floral arrangement that didn't need adjusting, she noticed a figure standing alone in the darkness beyond the glass, a young woman in a gown too fine for its obvious age, her posture rigid with that particular dignity that comes from enduring what should not be endured. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest, recognition sharp and immediate, because she knew that Stance intimately had inhabited it for 8 long years, and when Julian appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne, he followed her gaze out into the rain-drenched garden and asked quietly what she was thinking, his voice carrying that note of gentle concern he used only with her, only in private moments when no one else could hear the warmth beneath his customary reserve. She turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her from drowning in loneliness and shame, whose cold exterior had proven to conceal the most loyal and tender heart she'd ever known, and said simply that she saw herself out there, saw the girl she'd been before he'd brought her inside, and she watched understanding dawn in his expression, followed by something that looked remarkably like pride, as he nodded once and told her to go, that he would manage the guests in her absence, that some rescues couldn't wait for convenient timing. Eliza set down her champagne glass and made her way through the ballroom, slipping out the terrace doors into the October rain that fell with the same relentless persistence she remembered from all those years of standing outside looking in, and she approached the young woman who startled at her presence, clearly not expecting the Duchess herself to seek her out in the garden, and Eliza introduced herself gently, asked the girl's name, Miss Catherine Weston, daughter of a baronet whose gambling debts had recently become public scandal, and listened, as Catherine explained haltingly, that she'd come because her mother insisted they maintain appearances, but she knew better than to presume she was welcome inside where decent people gathered. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes at the familiar words, the echo of her own past so clear in this stranger's voice, and she reached out to take Catherine's hand, felt the girl's fingers cold and trembling, and said firmly that she was very much welcome inside, that in fact the Duchess of Pemberton herself was inviting her in, and that anyone who objected could leave because this was her home and she decided who belonged here. She led Catherine inside much as Julian had once led her, though with gentleness where he'd used determination, and she brought the girl to the fire, called for tea and blankets, and stayed beside her while the ballroom whispered and speculated, because she remembered too well what it felt like to face a crowd alone, and she would not let this girl endure that particular loneliness. Julian watched from across the room, saw his wife offering another lost soul the same protection he'd once offered her, and the fierce love he felt in that moment nearly overwhelmed him. because Eliza had taken the pain of her past and transformed it into compassion, had survived her suffering and emerged not bitter but kind, and he understood that this was who she'd always been beneath the rain and shame. This generous spirit he'd recognized even when she couldn't recognize it in herself. The evening progressed and Catherine gradually relaxed under Eliza's gentle attention, and when the musicians struck up a waltz, Julian crossed the ballroom to his wife, bowed formally despite 3 years of marriage, and led her onto the floor while Catherine watched from the fire with an expression of cautious hope. And as they turned together in the familiar pattern of the dance, Eliza looked up at her husband and saw him smiling, actually smiling, that rare expression he reserved only for her, only for moments when his happiness exceeded his ability to contain it. The rain continued outside, visible through the tall windows, droplets running down glass like tears, but inside there was warmth and light and music, and 2 people who'd found each other in the storm now danced together in safety, having learned that the coldest hearts sometimes love most deeply once warmed, that patience and endurance eventually lead to belonging, that standing in the rain for 8 years or 8 minutes or 8 decades doesn't mean you'll stand there forever, because somewhere, someone is watching through the window, seeing you in your loneliness, preparing to bring you inside. Dear listener, perhaps you've stood outside looking in. Perhaps you've felt the weight of shame or scandal, or simply not belonging. Perhaps you've endured when endurance seemed the only option left. And if so, know this: transformation takes time. Love finds us in unexpected places, dressed in unexpected faces. Hope persists, even through years of loneliness, because the human heart is more resilient than we imagine and more deserving of warmth than we believe. And the very qualities that make you feel unsuitable for love, your dignity in suffering, your loyalty despite cost, your quiet strength in bearing unbearable things, these are often exactly what draws the right person to recognize you, to see you, to choose you. May you find your shelter from the storm. May you discover that the rain eventually ends. May you learn that being brought inside is not charity but recognition, not rescue but homecoming. And may you rest peacefully tonight, knowing that your story, like Eliza and Julian's, is still unfolding, still moving toward warmth and belonging and love. This story comes to you from Evoked Narrative, where we believe in the power of patience, the possibility of transformation, and the persistence of hope. Subscribe to join us for more tales of unlikely love and hard-won redemption, because everyone deserves to come in from the rain.